All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking two completely fascinating and honestly totally contrasting architectural responses to how our cities are growing. I mean, we're looking at a massive global shift toward urban living right now, and how the ways we literally build our living spaces are reflecting our absolute deepest social values.
Just think about the sheer scale of the challenge we're facing for a second. 2 billion people. That is the expected global population increase over just the next 30 years. And almost all of that staggering growth, it's going to happen in urban areas, specifically in the exploding megacities of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We are literally witnessing the climax of a story that's been building since the 18th century. The massive, unstoppable migration from the agricultural village straight into the commercial city.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, our response to this incredible explosion in megacities is going to fundamentally shape the way we live, interact, and honestly survive as a society. Are we going to build spaces that bring us together, or are we going to put up structures that just push us apart? Because the architectural choices we're making right now, they're not just about bricks and mortar. They are entirely about human connection versus human isolation.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to track the megacity explosion, the rise of the global suburb, and the privatization of our streets. After that, we'll look at the rebellion against all this sprawl, dive into designing new town urbanity, and finally wrap up by comparing these two wildly different visions of home.
Okay, part 2, the rise of the global suburb and escaping the urban core. Let's kick this off by looking at how the wealthiest citizens are reacting to the really overwhelming growth of megacities in the developing world. As these historic city centers get more and more congested and municipal services start breaking down, those who can afford it are, quite frankly, looking for the nearest exit.
Architectural historian Robert Fishman actually gives us a brilliant framework to understand this flight. Historically speaking, there were basically two ways the middle and upper classes dealt with rapid city growth. You had the continental model, think of Haussmann's Paris, where the wealthy and the state poured money into making a beautiful, highly serviced city center, which ultimately pushed poor residents out to the edges. But today's megacities, they are overwhelmingly adopting what's called the Anglo-American model. Instead of fixing up the crowded center, the upper middle class is just opting out entirely. They're fleeing to these highly privatized, low-density settlements on the extreme edge of the city. Essentially, they're building these new bourgeois utopias as far from the chaos of the urban core as possible.
And a perfect, almost unbelievable example of this sits right outside Beijing. Seriously, you can't make this up. A Chinese developer literally toured Irvine, California, and decided, you know what? Prosperous residents don't want central city high-rises. They want American-style houses. So he goes back to Beijing and builds Orange County, China, a $60 million cloned gated community. It featured these million-dollar American-style tract mansions, complete with open floor plans and cathedral ceilings, dropped right near the 2008 Olympic site. They advertised it as pure American, and it sold out instantly. This is the global suburb in action, folks, just copy-pasting the spatial patterns of privilege from the US all over the globe.
Moving on to part 3, privatization and cars, and the driven divide. Let's unpack the primary forces actually enabling all this massive physical decentralization. Because you really can't have a sprawling edge city without a way to bypass the broken systems of the center, right?
And the absolute key to that bypass is the car. Look at this staggering surge in car ownership matched against population growth. Sao Paulo went from 1 million people in 1940 to 17 million today. But get this, paired with 4.5 million cars. In Beijing, their famously massive bicycle culture is being rapidly wiped out by 1.5 million cars. In Manila, vehicle ownership literally doubled in just 10 years. And why is this happening? Because public transit systems in these exploding megacities often just completely fail under the weight of congestion. The automobile lets the wealthy entirely bypass those failing public systems, essentially creating a private rolling bubble between their edge city homes and their decentralized offices.
But here's the catch. This retreat to the edges creates a severe, almost jarring social divide. Because as the wealthy build these pristine, manicured suburbs, they invariably sit right next door to massive, completely informal shantytowns, where millions are living without even basic services. This severe juxtaposition is basically a mirror image of the 19th century industrial inequality that originally shocked Friedrich Engels in Manchester. Engels was appalled by the deep class divisions of the first industrial shock cities. Honestly, if he were to return today, the modern megacity's extreme contrast between edge city wealth and favela poverty would be the exact same story, just on a scale 100 times larger. And this desire for isolation, it reaches absolute sci-fi levels of extreme in places like Sao Paulo's Alphaville.
We're talking about a gated suburb of 30,000 people dedicated to style, but above all, to security. They've got high walls, hidden cameras, and an astonishing private army of 1,100 armed security guards with watchdogs. I mean, security costs alone make up 20% of their infrastructure budget. It was even marketed to the public on primetime Brazilian soap operas as the ultimate dream lifestyle. And the craziest part? To avoid the staggering murder rates and crushing traffic below, the richest residents literally commute by private helicopter from one of the suburb's 3 helipads. It is the ultimate manifestation of building a fortress to keep the city out.
All right, part 4, the Sprawl Rebellion and the post-war British pivot. Let's shift gears entirely and look at a very different historical reaction to this exact kind of exclusionary, low-density sprawl. To do that, we need to travel back to post-World War II Britain. So, after the Second World War, a group of modernist British architects essentially rebelled against sprawling, isolated development, stuff they kind of dismissively called prairie planning. To them, it felt endless, isolating, and honestly just lacking soul. Instead, they chased a concept they called urbanity. They believed future developments should be planned to a much higher density. The goal was to create a visual, town-like quality in architecture that prioritized a really cohesive, visually stimulating public life rather than the private isolation of the suburb.
And architect Sir Frederick Gibbard is the guy who took this theory and made it concrete. Using the mandate of the 1946 New Towns Act, he actually got to test these high-density, social betterment theories in the real world. He was appointed to plan Harlow Newtown from the ground up. Gibbard was absolutely determined to fight against that low-density sprawl of the past. He wanted to embed urbanity right into the DNA of Harlow, proving that yes, you could plan an entirely new settlement from scratch that still felt like a tight-knit, visually cohesive historic town.
Which brings us to part 5, designing new town urbanity and the Townscape campaign. Because you have to wonder, how do you actually engineer this feeling of community and visual cohesion out of thin air? How do you take an empty field and make it feel like a vibrant, interconnected town? Well, the Architectural Review championed specific design checklists to pull this off. They launched a campaign called Townscape, arguing that town planning isn't just about housing, it's about treating the spaces between the buildings as outdoor rooms. They pushed for elements like intricacy, making sure there was a rich diversity in the layout. They used undulation and projection and recession to provide a human scale that naturally grips your eye as you walk past. But above all, they focused on enclosure, that cozy feeling of being held within a civic space, and floorscape, meaning they treated the paving and texturing of the ground between buildings as being just as vital as the buildings themselves.
By carefully engineering these unified facades and shared pedestrian floorscapes, these planners firmly believed they could organically encourage social interaction rather than isolation. Think about it. By using long terraces, designing shared open fronts without those massive private fences, and strategically planning the gaps between buildings, Gibbard and his contemporaries were actively trying to pull people out of their private bubbles and into the public sphere. The architecture itself was literally designed to foster a sense of shared community.
And finally, part 6, 2 visions of home, walls versus squares. Let's take a step back and directly compare these 2 dominant, yet entirely opposed, philosophies of modern living that we've just unpacked.
Here we can clearly see the tale of 2 ideals. On one side, we have the global suburb. It's entirely driven by the automobile, defined by high gates, private security, and, helipads. It is inherently exclusionary, custom designed to isolate privilege from the surrounding urban crisis. Then, stacked right against that, we have new town urbanity. This is a philosophy driven by pedestrians, defined by carefully curated townscapes and visual unity. It's intentionally inclusionary, built from the ground up to force interaction and cultivate public life. Ultimately, it's the desperate desire for private isolation squaring off against the hopeful engineering of connected community.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. As humanity faces just unprecedented urban growth over the coming decades, which of these 2 visions is truly equipped to be our future habitat? Are we going to keep retreating behind heavily guarded walls, isolating ourselves in these fragmented global suburbs, or will we find a way to reclaim the public square, designing cohesive spaces that foster true urbanity and human connection? Because at the end of the day, the choice of how we build will ultimately define who we become.